Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I am Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to support the channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. This video is part of a series of videos entitled Questionable Witnesses, An Atheist Teaches Life of Christ. Today we'll be looking at Luke 2:21-38, where Jesus is presented in the temple and circumcised and we are asking the question, did all of this happen? I am teaching the Gospels much like I did many times in my churches as a pastor over the years, but now I'm teaching it as an atheist. The whole issue of this series has been to get to exactly how many witnesses do the Gospel accounts actually have, and are they credible? The Bible's low bar criteria of 2 or 3 witnesses is our first test. The next test is modern scholarship, which is a little bit more rigorous as to providing us the truth or falsehood of claims with other criteria. Plus, I want to make any remarks about the story that I think are pertinent, and I also want to make some deconversion notes. To summarize the story, Jesus' parents bring Jesus to the temple 8 days after he is born to have him circumcised, and they name him Jesus at this time. They offer up 2 turtle doves or pigeons as a sacrifice for the dedication. This is all in fulfilling the Old Testament law about dedication of the firstborn, as noted by the writer, which appears in Exodus 13:2 and 12, and Leviticus 5:11 and Leviticus 12:8. The firstborn belongs to the Lord and has to be redeemed, and so the Lord allows Jesus' parents basically to do exactly that. After this, 2 people approach the couple. The first being Simeon, who is stated to be a righteous man, and prophesies over Jesus and notes that he can now die because he has seen the salvation of the Lord. He then also prophesies over Mary, saying that she too will suffer, and because of her son being killed. The second person that approaches Jesus' parents is Anna, who is said to have been the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher, who had been a widow for some time, having only been married for 7 years, but since then had dedicated herself to the temple in fasting and prayers and never left. She too says great things about Jesus, but her exact words are not recorded, only summarized. So let's begin with our first test, which is the 2 or 3 witnesses demanded by the scriptures. In this case, of the 4 Gospels, the Gospel of Luke is the only one who records this story. So only 1 witness, and they don't count really even because Old Testament witnesses had to be present and name themselves, which the writer does not do. They also don't tell us where the story came from. There's no indication of source. There is conjecture and speculation that the stories came from Mary herself, but that is never actually stated. So in this case, the account fails the Bible's own criteria for eyewitness testimony. I say this almost every video, but that's because it's true. When we get to modern scholarship, the failure is even more complete to provide historical evidence, as the only place that this story even appears in historical antiquity is here in Luke. The thing is, there's so many things that God could have done and used to satisfy modern scholarship. Verified temple records of the couple named Mary and Joseph offering up 2 pigeons or turtle doves and naming their son Jesus after having him circumcised would have been nice, but no such thing exists. While there is nothing really unbelievable about the story, as it was common occurrence for couples to dedicate their firstborn boys at the temple, the other parts with Simeon and Anna are not as common. But these 2 people only appear in this story in Luke and nowhere else in any historical documents. And that is something that would also have been helpful. God, who is said to know all things, would have known the future standards of historical verification and would have worked these things into this. But as it stands, this account is on the level of hearsay and would not be used as evidence in either historical or legal context. And hearsay testimony, by the way, can never be really trusted. The other issues that are pertinent, Jesus is circumcised. For many of us in the non-believing camp, this is immoral because you're removing a part of somebody's body without their consent, and it takes a religion to delude people into thinking cutting off a part of an infant's body is okay. But that's a larger topic for another day, and I will only mention it here that it is a problem. There is also some thought that the 2 turtle doves indicates that the family was poor, but not necessarily, as what is offered is really about a choice in the matter, and the law of Moses does offer options. Seems like God being the father, there would be some part of the story where he provided a more expensive option to dedicate his son, but no such story exists, not even in the Bible. Number 3, the Simeon and Anna stories are written after the fact. So it's very easy to write in that they prophesied over Jesus and that it was fulfilled. only if it could be verified that they spoke these words at the time of Jesus' of life when he was being dedicated would it truly be prophetic in a certain sense. But even then, you have to prove the supernatural involvement of God, which is so far I've never heard or seen when it comes to prophetic utterances. It's the one test that continues to be failed, and it fails here again. There's definitely a case of post hoc writing things in to lend authenticity to Jesus' life after the fact here. Number 4, Simeon's word to Mary also indicate that the idea of veneration of Mary is present, and that is a later development in church theology. If Luke is written later, it makes sense that these verses are in here, but not at the time that the conservatives claim that they are written. And that the writer would have been of the crowd that wanted to venerate Mary seems to be fairly obvious by this point in consideration of everything that is said about Mary. And so he adds this in. Some deconversion notes. I think when I look at this story, I think when it comes from a deconversion standpoint, one of the things that really gets challenged by circumcision in particular is the morals and ethics of doing something to somebody else's body without their consent. And it's something that I wrestled with. It's those issues where you have the morality that people have about not harming one another, and then you have religion coming in and saying it's okay to do certain actions. I think it seems like such a small issue, but it really is the difference between divine command theory, which basically sits there and says you do this because God's word tells you to, even though the action might be considered immoral in a purely secular context, versus the secular morality, which says you really shouldn't be harming anybody without their consent. You shouldn't be removing body parts or things like that without their consent. And you really shouldn't be doing this to infants. It's where you suddenly begin to realize that this Iron Age morality with circumcision and many other customs that are, basically kind of weird, but often demote somebody else in favor of somebody else, begin to disappear for you. And I remember when I was struggling with this morally, I still struggle with it because circumcision still happens in medical facilities in the United States at the request of the parents, and it's for many reasons, but are given, like cleanliness and aesthetics and things like that. But it's like you still haven't dealt with the basic moral issue. And when I was deconverting, there was issues like this one and many others where I would move forward and go, okay, pushing my morality to say, this really is wrong. Okay, it's just wrong to do this to an infant child. And this is one of many of those things that you begin to realize that the Bible's morality is not only bad. I mean, I had a conversation recently in the comments where you got to have this superior moral lawgiver and all this other stuff. My response was, your lawgiver advocates, regulates slavery and doesn't remove it. Your lawgiver orders genocide. Your lawgiver, it's like, this is your lawgiver. You say this lawgiver is superior, and I'm giving you evidence of how he is not. Okay, and plus, no, you don't. And you begin to realize that human morality, when you put all the secular aspects into it, and I know this is a big thing about circumcision here, but it's like when you begin to realize that even in little issues like circumcision, the biblical morality falls short of respecting any kind of individual rights or individual sovereignty right from the jump, okay? For baby boys, in particular 8 days later after they're born, we're already violating the rights of human beings, and it's religion that leads us to that. And it's kind of one of those things where you begin to realize that maybe the biblical morality isn't all that's cracked up to be. And that begins to carry over into your understandings of slavery and genocide and the rest of it. And I know I'm going to get in the comments, the slavery wasn't really... Yes, it was. You need to read all the context. For non-Jewish people, the slavery was perpetual, and they were handed off as property to family members and things like that. So I really get tired of theists trying to defend that aspect with a very tired old argument. But the point is, for a deconversion standpoint, it's the understanding, you begin to understand that biblical morality has its problems. It really is very problematic. And so it's not, because it comes from on high, it just doesn't wash. It's divine command theory basically says an action is basically immoral or immoral based on whether God says to do it. Well, God commands circumcision, and so Jesus goes through circumcision because his Father commanded it, quote unquote. The other thing that becomes really problematic in the story from a deconversion standpoint is you begin to realize that these gospel writers, at this point you can tell that the gospel writers already have an agenda, particularly Matthew and Luke. Mark, it's a little harder to find his agenda. He seems to be, pushing his own narrative about who Jesus was as the Son of Man. But when you get to Matthew and Luke is definitely injecting some theology of his own. He's not just, he's approaching it as a quote-unquote historian. A lot of people think, I'm not sure about that. I would better qualify that as somebody who's collecting the stories about Jesus and trying to put them into an order. That's not necessarily a historian. That's just a story collector who's trying to put some sense to it. We don't really have a historian. But what Luke is also doing that I learned as a Pentecostal is he's injecting a lot of his own theology about who Jesus was, about the Holy Spirit, about all this other stuff, prophetic utterances. He has a different view a little bit than Matthew when you really look at it. He's injecting his own theology into it. And so there's an agenda. And once you realize that people with an agenda often are going to skew and present only what they want to. It's the main reason I think if Matthew knew about Luke's stories and Luke knew about Matthew's stories, there's a reason why they didn't include them. But either they didn't know each other's stories, and so they're each writing their own thing about what they know, or they're putting in this early narrative what they want to be there because of the point they're making. Luke doesn't really have an axe to grind with the Herodians. He doesn't seem to be engaged in that conversation at all, but Matthew certainly is. And so what we're going to see as we go forward is this back and forth between the two gospels, because neither gospel really gives us the same account. And so from a deconversion point of view, you begin to realize that these people have an agenda right now. And because they have an agenda, is what they say historically accurate, or are they bringing in stories and events that allow them to make their agenda and their point? And when you begin to realize, there's nothing wrong, I suppose, with having an agenda, but don't sit there and say you're being an objective historian at that point. So that's kind of that part of deconversion, is where you begin to have this different view of the Bible, where you begin to realize that each of these writers is being very human. They have an agenda. They're including parts of the stories that fit their agenda, and they're excluding other parts maybe that, because Matthew doesn't include stuff in Luke, Luke doesn't include stuff in Matthew. They're both writing a birth narrative that's completely different, and you have to mesh them together, historically speaking, in order to put some sort of timeline order to it, not necessarily historically, to get what you're after here. And so from a deconversion point of view, you begin to realize how human the Bible is. And that's why I do these Bible study series, is to show that the book is not inspired by God. It's not some special revelation from God. It is very much a human book written by human beings with human agendas. And you can see the agenda here of trying to venerate Mary, for instance, with Luke, but Matthew really doesn't do that. He doesn't even pay attention to Mary at all. Okay. And a lot of people, well, that's because he's getting from Mary from the stories. I said, yeah, but if these stories are going around, everybody would have had these stories, and it would have made sense for both writers to include the whole thing, but they don't. So they either didn't know each other's stories, or they only included the parts of Jesus's birth narrative that fit their agenda. Either way, we have a flaw here of not getting the 2 or 3 witnesses that we need, and not doing all this other stuff that we need from a historical standpoint. So you begin to come to another conclusion about the gospel accounts in particular, is that everything that they say happened is really questionable. That's why the name of the series, Questionable Witnesses. there is no definitive historical account of Jesus's life at this point. What we have is writers with an agenda telling stories that can't be verified. And when you hit that point in your deconversion and the Bible starts to lose its potency, because I get a lot of comments on this series so far about, oh, you need to read it through the eyes of faith, or you need to do this. And it's like, from a deconversion standpoint, then faith is useless. Okay, because all you're basically saying is, don't trust your reason, don't trust all this other stuff. Don't look at the man in the corner. Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain, is really the way that's working. And unfortunately, when you're deconverting, you can't go back. So there's that aspect of it. And so when you begin to deconvert and you begin to look at the Gospels, you begin to see them in a very new light. That these aren't people that are being inspired by the Holy Spirit. These are people with agendas, theological agendas, spiritual agendas, historical agendas. Like Matthew is just like, he's going after Jesus being the Messiah. So all the other major contenders for being the Messiah, including Herod the Great, have to be chopped down. They have to be chopped down, and so he does that. And so we end up with this narrative that we have to knit together. And so God isn't very good at inspiring his word, okay, in a way that future critics would be silenced, okay. There's a lot of ways that God could have done this, like records from the temple, some sort of historical record from a Jewish rabbi that mentions Anna and Simeon, as being regulars at the temple at this time. I mean, there's so many ways that this story could have been authenticated to modern scholarship, but it just isn't there. And so I'm left to conclude, from a deconversion point of view, that Matthew and Luke, at this point particularly Luke, are making things up to fit an agenda. And so I kind of, you have to get past that. You can't sit there and say, just take it by faith. It's like, no, God would definitely know that people would have this problem. And if he wants all people to be saved, as he says in 1 Timothy 2, that he would know that in the future he's going to have to provide better evidence, for what's happening in this, and would inspire people to do so. That's not a question of faith. You can still have a choice about whether to believe. And when you get rid of the nonsense of faith, of being the proof of things, it's like, no, faith doesn't prove a thing. Okay, it's a nice little cultic trick to get people to deny their own senses, deny their own reason, deny their own stuff, but it isn't valuable. And so when people want to tell me that in the comments, it's like, I've already been down that route, thank you very much, and no, I'm not going to accept it. But as always, I'd be interested to hear all of what you have to say in the comments. There's a whole bunch of this series to go, and I'm thankful that interest in it is growing. So keep there. So thank you very much. I appreciate everybody for stopping by. There's many ways to support the channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion. My PayPal link is in the description, so if you want to donate to me directly, that's the best way. But you can also do super chat, super thanks, whenever, and I encourage that. It's always very helpful and comes at very helpful times, so thank you very much for that. But the best way to support the channel is membership. That monthly support allows me to continue to do my work and do it without worrying so much about the YouTube algorithm and focusing more on doing the things that you guys love and enjoy with this series. So thank you very much for that. And I appreciate all of that. I appreciate all my members. Thank you very much to all of them. You guys are awesome. I appreciate all of you. And just thank you. And as always, live your best life. You only get one to go around and then it's over. So you don't want to take your time, your money, and opportunities and give them to yourself, the people you love and care for, to make this a better world. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.